They decided to leave the blood stains right there on the pews in the little church, just so they could remember. Now, that's an interesting idea, just to leave blood stains on the pew in a church. I wonder what the story is about that. Well, on this Sunday night, June the 6th, I'd like to tell you a little bit of that, along with the personal story that it'll bring forth too. This is Interesting Ideas, and the program begins right now. As I'm talking to you at this little studio here in Tucson, Arizona, I'm remembering a time many years ago, and a long, long ways ago from Tucson, Arizona. And I have a little symbol of what I'm going to talk about. I've traveled a lot around the world, and I must have a few souvenirs, but I can't think of any that mean anything to me except the one that I'm holding in my hand right now. And what it is, it's about just a handful, and it's kind of a smooth, obviously smooth because perhaps water had washed over it for some time. It's a smooth little rock, and I picked it up on a very famous beach. You see, I was in Normandy along with my wife Karen. We were having a little brief vacation and decided to leave our work and home in the Netherlands, and took the car and gathered up a few friends and decided we were going to spend a little time in Paris and the environs there. And so we decided that it would be good to go to the World War II famous battlefields at Normandy Beach. And so off we went, and it was delightful to get out of the traffic and all of the big stuff of Paris and begin to find ourselves in many ways kind of a very different part of the world. In terms of France, it was rural, it was quiet, and of course, if it wasn't for something that happened 77 years ago today, no one would ever pay any attention to this little stretch of land in France. Well, of course, many of you now are right on to what I am talking about. It was, again, 77 years ago today, on the 6th of June, 1944, that thousands of American soldiers, also with British and Canadian soldiers on one side, and perhaps some others that might be able to be accumulated from other of the Allied countries, stormed the beaches of Normandy to try and begin the campaign to throw the evil Nazi Empire out of Europe. And it was quite a day. And today, some of you have already heard the many remembrances of that time and of that place. And I just thought it would be good to take a few memory moments, because what happened, again to me, was when I made my way along that beach, I could just feel it. And in my own historical mind, because I was a history teacher for many years, I just began to try and imagine what it must have been like. And then to actually see where they talk about the sheer cliffs that the Rangers had to climb up to take out the German machine gun nests. And when you see what they did, you can hardly believe it. The cliff walls, on a clear day with beautiful weather, with no obstacles, climbing those cliffs would have been almost an impossible routine. And these people did it, not on a clear day, but a cloudy, almost rainy day, and of course with gunfire and bombing and dying all around them. And they still made it to the top, and in doing so began to establish the first foothold, the first, hey, this might work. And no one knew whether it would or not. It's said that General Eisenhower had basically composed two sets of letters, and which, if the landing had been successful, this is what the statement would be. If, as what might have happened, is the landing had stalled, it had failed, and even worse, had been pushed back into the sea for the invaders and the soldiers to die, or for us to be able to pick up a few of the survivors. If it had failed, he had a statement about that, and I'm told his note acknowledged full reality. There would be no excuses, there would be no evasions, there would be no explanations, just simply a take responsibility and perhaps take the consequences. And of course, thousands of people would have paid the price for that mistake, for what had gone wrong. Well, the story is very well known. If you do, after I did, we did climb up, and then we walked among the endless row of graves. Over 9,000 of them. Now keep in mind, these are the ones that were buried there, who died at that invasion. Please keep in mind that a lot of bodies were recovered and many were shipped back home so that the family and the relatives could bury their wounded and deceased hero. But over 9,000 of them are resting in the incredibly moving cemetery there in Normandy. And I would suggest that whatever you can, whenever you can, if you have some kind of trip scheduled, particularly to Europe, and for sure if you do make your way to Paris, it's about an hour and a half away, take some time to experience what it's like to walk the sacred grounds of Normandy. I'm told that in one of the places that there was a small church just off in after the landing had been able to get going. There's a small church there, and of course as the bloody fighting went on, many of the wounded and of course dying soldiers were actually brought into that church to try to obviously see if we could recover them and help them out of their wounds, or perhaps in some way find a way of making sure that their now sacred remains were at least notified and taken care of. Well, the story is that yet today that you can go there, and the people of that little congregation, when they cleaned up the church afterwards, decided that on some of the pews, the blood that was there was going to be left there. They didn't clean it up. They just let it sit there, and of course the stain of it began to stay there and sink in there, and there it is, 70 years later. And of course, you now get the point. Obviously, when you walk into that small church and see the blood stains on the pews, you remember. And you have not only a remembrance, but an incredible emotional experience about what it must have been like. I will also tell you that another depressing thing that you will find among all of the encouraging and inspiring things you will find in Normandy is, as someone said, do the math. Look at the date they were born, and look at the date June 6, 44, when they died. And of course, you will find, as someone said, many of them are 18 years of age. 18 years of age. And then someone said, not many, hundreds, thousands, much more. And of course, we all know, those of us who've passed the age of 18 know that that's when you think you've got everything ready to go. That's when you're going to start out. You probably just graduated from high school, or you found a way to make your little bit of a step of freedom, and you find yourself, either through a choice you made and many times likely a choice that somebody else made, you find yourself wading ashore, loaded down with guns and weapons and people trying to kill you. And in many cases, they are succeeding in doing just that. Yep, I would encourage you to read some of the stories. Perhaps also read some of the stories of the children who grew up. They weren't baby boomers. They were born before the war was over. And in fact, some of them never saw their father at all. Never knew him, never saw him. They were too small. And they grew up not having a father and trying to live a life in, of course, the terrible grief of their mother and the family, and of course knowing how do you make a life work after that. And of course, hundreds and thousands and millions of them did just that. But of course, it was never quite the same. As one of my dear relatives said, you know, what happened that day in 1944 changed my life, and I wasn't even born yet. And indeed it did. So those are just a few thoughts for this 6th of June. Obviously, those few who survived to this day are obviously in their 90s or later, and we'll still see the stories of a few of them, but of course now most of the survivors are even gone. And at the time, because I was able, when I was there, to visit with many of them, because it was some years ago, and as I was carrying my rock, tell the stories. As one even incredible story was that even in the midst of that, there was grace that sometimes came up. One young soldier, somewhat reminiscent of the story of, Saving Private Ryan, told the story that he was fighting and all of a sudden he jumped down on a trench to avoid what he thought was an incoming artillery shell, and it was, and he looked up after surviving, and there was a German soldier with his rifle pointed right smack between his eyes. And of course, in great panic, he was going to die. It turns out he was very young, and the German soldier was also young, but he was also quite a bit older, probably in his late 20s or 30s, realized that there was a young boy there, looked at him, and just said, "Raus! Raus! Get out of here! Get out of here!" And he let him live. And he went on to live a life, raise a family. So even in the midst, as I said in writing the prayers for church this morning, God, you were there. That's right. God, you were there on the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. And the same God who was there is there today. And some of the same concerns and some of the same tragedies are still there. And even in that, from time to time, if we're fortunate enough or if we look well enough, we will see that God's grace will still work its way in even the great tragedies of our lives. Well, that's an interesting idea, wasn't it? Isn't it? And still is. They decided to leave the blood on the pews in the church. I'm Stan Houston. I'm a grateful man. I've been blessed in many ways, and because of what many people suffered and died for and were not blessed with, you and I have those opportunities to continue to live well and hopefully to serve others. And all the best and blessings to you, my friend. May it go well. But again, take a moment, just a moment, time and two, to remember the blood on the pews and say a word of thank you. And thank you. Bye for now.